Hi, Tom. How are you?
Hi, very good. How are you?
Very nice to meet you. I'm here with
Yeah,
Now, who will take the response.
How are you, Tom?
And apologies for the tech issue. I don't know what's going on with the webinar. I think we added you to your ETH email, but doesn't matter.
yeah, no, it's all good. It seems like it's working fine now. It's just it was asking for, it gave me a University of Sydney login page.
Okay, all good.
All good.
So we will give people a few minutes to join. It's 6:30 in Sydney, but people will still join us, I think.
Okay, cool.
And it's the last one of the series, Tom. So we started on Tuesday with a Sedegar Keller, with the one at DTH that probably you are familiar to, the student housing. And then we had on Wednesday Philman to discuss the student village near Aarhus in Denmark. And then yesterday we had David come with the new college. And today we close with you. Very different ones to discuss a huge house lecture series, which is tied to the studio. And also it's almost a public lecture for the whole school. Okay.
Fantastic. Yeah, great. Good. Do I need to test anything?
Do you want to test the share screen?
Sure.
Yeah, do that. Hi, Tom. I'm Steve.
Hi, Steve. Are
Yeah,
you seeing this okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's working well.
Yeah,
Yeah. Excellent.
perfect.
Okay.
How are you doing? All good?
Yeah. Yeah. It's fun following on from David.
Yes.
David and I were at college together.
Really?
Yeah, we were in the same year.
He didn't say that, but he finished that Tom will have a different opinion of what is the type of the college next week, tomorrow. And he also talked about the cornice of the college, that maybe you also have something to say about it.
Yes, yeah. So David's playing around with the old boys in Oxford, and we are playing around with the brutalists in Cambridge.
In Cambridge, yeah. He was attacking the 60s brutalist ones yesterday, but he didn't attack you directly, obviously.
Okay, right. Okay, well, that's good to know. Then I can take a swipe backwards.
Yeah, I don't think if he will be so happy that that you are taking the congrats, by the way, on the Tate Liverpool, because he loves that column. He loves that columns, as we all know.
Yeah. No, I know. Well, I mean, everybody claims a bit of sterling, right?
Yeah.
So, no, that's fun. That's nice. That's a really nice project to win.
Yeah, very exciting to reimagine that one.
Yeah, no, that's good. No, I mean, David and I go back. We edited the department magazine together.
I didn't know that. Which issue is an old one or what?
Yeah. This is back in the 90s. A magazine called Scroop. And we taught together for a year actually.
At the Metropolitan or?
No, in Cambridge.
In Cambridge as well?
Yeah.
Okay, we need to check that. That's history.
You ran the entire magazine, right? Like you were the editors of the magazine, the entire time, or?
Sorry?
It was not a special issue.
Yeah.
It was a special issue. No, you were running the magazine. You were the editors of the magazine.
Yeah. This is a student magazine. I don't think it's going anymore, but it went for a long time, and it was edited by students. And David and I did it one year.
Yeah.
No, it's fun. No, we're old friends, and we did a building. We did these buildings in Greenwich, and our buildings are literally next to each other.
So yeah, we've seen the recent pictures. Also looking a lot to discuss on that one.
Yeah. No, that was quite fun. That was like, who can out pop who?
Maybe both of you have done to the others.
Yeah, no, it's all good.
It's already good. It's being used already, the district in Greenwich. Nice. I haven't seen any pictures of yours with people and with objects and with things yet, with traces.
Do you know what? I don't have any pictures of them because I think it was over Christmas that they were moving in, or just after. And I know of the people who've moved in, but I haven't seen them in action yet.
Fantastic. Okay, we are gonna give people 2 minutes to come in, and then we'll do a very short introduction. Then you go with the lecture, and then we are doing this thing that we call the long shot. So the first day, Kate Finney did this long shot response or something like that. I make it up, Tom, so I think it's fine. We set the rules. The second day, I took the answer. Yesterday, Andrew Leach took the answer from the University of Sydney, and today Urtzi Grau will close, and then you have an answer to, and that's it. We normally keep them short and sharp for Zoom. Okay. Okay,
and the talk I think is, I mean, I saw that in the schedule that I got is 45 minutes. The talk is probably a little bit over 45 minutes, probably between 45 and an hour, if that's okay.
You choose. Don't worry. It will be good, I'm sure.
Okay, cool. Thanks. It's not going to get like Zoom cut out. Zoom.
No. We are not that brutal. We are not that brutal like Shepard Robson. Don't worry.
Well, this is an absolutely horrible day in Zurich at the moment.
Here is nice. It's winter. It has been raining a lot, but today it was a pretty sunny day, to be honest. It was quite nice. I was in the office most of the day, but it still was quite nice. The winter has been very strange in Sydney. Have you been to Sydney, Tom?
I haven't, you know. I've been to Melbourne many times.
Well, yeah, with the project, no? Next time you need to visit Sydney then.
Yeah. And my sister used to live in Sydney, but a long time ago. My brother-in-law lives in Sydney. So we have family there. But somehow, because our client is very much kind of Melbourne and Canberra.
Yeah. So have you been to Canberra?
Yeah.
Yeah, some good stuff there.
Yeah, I love Canberra.
It's so strange. Yeah.
It's so strange.
Yeah, it's more strange than Milton Keynes, and you love Milton Keynes.
Exactly. No, because I love Milton Keynes, I felt very much at home in Canberra.
Yeah. That was what I was trying to bring up.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Milton Keynes with kangaroos.
Yes. No, it's very funny.
Amazing.
I go often because I also find it strangely fascinating, the place.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. No. Well, I've always had really good, really great visits. Mainly Melbourne, to be honest, and that's just fab.
Yeah.
Nice.
Okay.
Okay.
We are going to start, okay, Tom? And as I mentioned, I will do a very short introduction.
Sure.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the last talk of a huge house lecture series. And first, we're going to start with the acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the first Australians on whose traditional lands the University of Sydney stands, the Gadigal of the Euro Nation, and pay our respects to the elders, past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded, and they remain strong in their enduring connection to land, sea, community, and culture. And this evening, we are very happy to close the series with Tom Emerson from 6A Architect. Tom doesn't need much introduction, as you know, but I will read very briefly the short CV that they pass us. Tom Emerson was born in Paris in 1970 and co-founded 6A Architects with Stephanie MacDonald in London in 2001, producing buildings and landscapes for the arts and education, as the one we will see tonight. Alongside practice, he's the Dean of the Department of Architecture at the ETH in Zurich, where he's joining us today from Zurich in a bad day, as he pointed, as it usually happens in the grey Zurich, probably more grey than Oxford, Cambridge, and London. And he also leads there a studio that some of the students are quite familiar to, and a studio that explores the relationship between making, landscape, and ecology. And this all the extensive body of work that you all know from 6A, from Stephanie and Tom, from the Greenwich district that we were just discussing with Tom, to the Cowan Court that he will discuss today, and a series of books. No, they are also interested in publishing. As he said, he was with David together editing the Cambridge magazine, and also the famous Never Modern, or his Croquis, or the series of atlases, no, that I have shared with some of the students, Force, Galway, Glasgow, and more recently the Pasamak in Peru. And I think with that, please join me in welcoming Tom Emerson from 6A Architects. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you, Guillermo. Good, I suppose, good evening, everybody in Sydney. I'm talking to you from a very rainy Friday morning in Zurich. And I am going to start by sharing screen. I hope that's working okay for everybody. Are you seeing the screen okay? Yeah. Good. Well, yes, I'm going to talk to you today about Cowan Court in Cambridge. And I think that student housing project, I guess that you heard about David Con's new college yesterday. And so the contexts are in many ways have a great deal in common. And then probably, hopefully, we'll start being able to tease out some noticeable differences as well. As I just told Guillermo, David and I were students together. We were in the same year, at the same college, literally drawing boards, and they were drawing boards then, you know, like about 6 feet apart. So there's some sort of ancestry in common. We're great friends, and of course, then architecturally, our work has developed in different ways. And ours, let's say here particularly, as I said in the introduction, is very much related to making and the territory, the making and landscapes, and how landscapes have developed, let's say, settlements around the idea of garden. And that these landscapes, this idea of nature, which is going to be running through this talk, is as much is really a construction, is a kind of constructed. It's constructed physically, artificially, like this tree being imported, or but also conceptually, it is a kind of a constructed idea that goes way, way, way back. So on the left here we have the mock-up for planning application for Cowan Court. We had to do a one-to-one mock-up. And then maybe then that relates to the kind of foundational idea of both Oxford and Cambridge, which is the idea of the enclosed garden and kind of paradise. And essentially both these cities, both these institutions are growing out of monasteries, which is essentially the kind of the walled garden, paradise on earth, kind of developed for inhabitation. And they tend to have certain kind of elements in common, which you'll see from that biblical drawing, which is actually kind of Persian in origin, of course, but then kind of abstracted and developed over the centuries to be the cloister, the kind of the monastic cloister, which has a fountain in the middle, these two paths which represent the crossing of rivers, and then this kind of cloister around the outside in which different programs will arise over time. This is an aerial view of Cambridge, and then you'll see that essentially the city is a kind of aggregation of all of these courts. And here is the kind of aerial view of Cambridge, Trinity College here, King's College with the famous chapel here, the river going down the back. I think School of Architecture is down here somewhere. And so, and then going out a bit, then we have over here Churchill College. And Churchill College is different from the other ones, is it doesn't have a religious foundation. It's a post-war college, part of post-war welfare state kind of reconstruction housing, hospitals, but education was huge. But nevertheless, it adopts the kind of the mode of the traditional college, the mode of the kind of the court. I think in Oxford, they call them quads. In Cambridge, they call them courts. It's sort of to do with sort of slightly stupid rivalry between the two universities. But anyway, they still have a lot in common. And I suppose that my argument would be in this case that Cambridge is in fact a landscape structure, not a city. So that's really important in sort of conceptualizing how one makes a work. This is in fact the center of town. This is outside the Mill pub, right in the center of Cambridge. And you can see that it's kind of, in a sense, got way more in common with a kind of a landscape than it does a city. And then the project really takes on sort of two main sort of material thematics. One is timber frame construction here in LA on the right, but also the idea of kind of repair and material shifts that you get maybe in Japanese architecture, where the kind of the distinction between materialities and techniques gets blurred, particularly when it comes to repair. So this idea of wear and tear, the idea of the similarity and difference between materials. This is a detail of Churchill, of Cowan Court, soon after it was built, and we'll come back to that. But you can see the kind of roughness, and really this is coming out of an idea of brutalism, which I believe kind of David had something to say about yesterday. This is the original Churchill College, designed by Shepherd Robson in the late 50s. Very much kind of brick and concrete, a kind of idiom which was sort of characteristic of brutalism at the time, overexpressed structure, and then a series of courts, a series of about 10 courts, each one with the specimen tree. And again, you can sort of see the way that it's set up as a kind of landscape structure. This is the aerial view of the college. It's unusual in the sense it's one of the few colleges that has all of its grounds on one site. So it's got its playing fields. So it's got the Churchill archive at the center, and then it's got these playing fields, and then these are buildings were added later. There's a chapel over here, part of the original plan, and our site was here. Just going back a little bit, in terms of the sort of story, the architectural story of the project, it was the subject of probably the most important architectural competition of the post-war period, organized by Leslie Martin. There were 20 practices in it. And to some extent, the practices that worked on this competition ended up being the sort of the players of the next 20, 30 years of British post-war architecture. So this is the one that won by Shepherd Robson, which is this kind of ring of courts around a sort of central building, the competition entry. This is a very famous one by James Stirling, which didn't win, but it's rather kind of epic. It's like this mound of student bedrooms making a kind of defensive wall over then the institutional buildings within its center. And it was a project that was very important to Stirling, even though he didn't win, and to some extent, things like this little chapel building became the prototype for a school that he built later, and so on. Other architects, this is Chamberlain, Powell and Bond. So this is people who ended up doing the Barbican. But this is the sort of the winning one, which was considered to be not the most radical, but somehow buildable and affordable just about. Then the working drawings of the thing. And one of the interesting things is that they ran out of money. And you see these courtyards here, these were the last ones to be built, and they never built them. So they ended up building it with a kind of vista coming out of the main communal buildings out towards the landscape. And the fact that they didn't finish it has meant that the whole college has a kind of open structure at a kind of macro scale that it was intended. This is a Barbara Hepworth sculpture kind of in that vista, and then the chapel in the background. This is our site for the competition. So it was a competition in 2008. And we are talking about this part here, which is the lowest part of the site that is most prone to flooding, and of course not to close this open vista, which was the original plan. As you can see, this is the sort of the language. It's brick and with concrete banding, a concrete structure banding with these bay windows, teak windows. It's actually incredibly well built. It looks a little bit tired in those photographs. And then very, very importantly, the kind of the trees as sort of specimen trees. Each one is kind of named and logged. And our project is this white one here, which is just to redo another court. I'll just go through, these are some of the competition exercises we did when we did the competition. This is a version of it where you have one bedroom that is the thickness of the building. Is unbelievably inefficient and quite fun to play around with, but it could never happen. So our project is essentially a court building on the edge of the playing fields, and it's a sort of, in plan, it's a kind of doppelganger, a copy of the original one. These are the original court drawings. There are 6 staircases, so they're organized vertically rather than horizontally. And I don't know if you can see here, you get the bay windows end up being incredibly close to one another. And that meant that people's bedrooms tend to be quite closed. People keep their curtains drawn. So we decided that we would do a project where we would have a cloister in the center. So all the communal rooms would be, spaces would be facing the inner court, and all the bedrooms would be facing outwards. And that then these kind of communal spaces would shift as you go up the building, and that we would have a forest on the inside of it. So that was the kind of elevation of the building, how we kind of connect into the network of pathways that runs through the college. And the idea is that our building was almost like a kind of pavilion. It was like the pavilion version of the original college, because we kind of overlooking all the playing fields. And here we start seeing the beginning of this idea of the curve. Here it was in the balcony, so the building is flat, but the balconies are curved. And this is the kind of competition model from 2008, showing the building with a ring of balconies around the outside, and then the kind of the accommodation sort of within the square. And there's a sort of slight curve on this balcony to kind of give a bit more sort of sculptural tension to the overall object, the landscape. The other thing that is worth mentioning, I'll go very quickly through these, is we had 4 bedroom types. So we had this double height sort of studio. We had one where it was more kind of elongated, long, thin thing, and it was always about sleeping, socializing, and working. So each room has a kind of a very specific arrangement of eating, sleeping, working, eating, sleeping, working. And then here's one with a box bed, and so on. And then this is a little diagram of how the communal spaces would be organized. So this is our model, kind of, I think it was a 1:50 model. And then really importantly, this is our site. This is kind of part of the sort of natural history survey. And it's looking at the trees on site, and particularly these 3. These Judas trees, which were memorial trees to past members of the college who died, and they were dedicated to them. The pink ones were sick, and this is a survey of all of the trees in the courts. The first one here being planted by Winston Churchill in 1959. So the trees kind of provide a kind of social narrative of the evolution of the college. So that was very important to us. And then this is the landscape surrounding the college, which is this sort of meadowland. It's kind of very, very pretty mixed woodland meadowland, and that we would recreate that within the court of the college, that we would continue it through from outside into the inside. So these are the kind of the understory planting, and then the kind of birch forest. This is in a monastery very close to Cambridge. It has this kind of Siberian birches inside the courtyard, which we thought were just completely magical. So this is the sort of landscape plan. We would retain these Judas trees on a mound and then surround them by a kind of birch woodland. As I said, so this is the sort of the setup of the project for planning, different heights, the boards at the top. But then the financial crash happened, and the project died. So it disappeared. The college had no money, like everybody else. And meanwhile, during that time, we were working on things like Raven Row, which opened in 2009, which is a building, arts, contemporary art centre in the centre of London, based around this kind of archival material. We built the South London Gallery, which is very much a kind of a sort of inside-outside project to do with kind of gardens and interiors. And then by 2012, we were back in business. Actually, this is great, given that we're speaking in Australia today, you might understand this better than me. One of the critical things to get permission for the building was its relationship to the cricket field. And so some of you may understand and recognize the way that forgive me for not knowing the terms, I really know nothing about cricket, but the strip in the middle moves during the season. And the circumference, the circle there is a 6, so hitting the ball out. And the building we had to prove to the authorities that the building would not interrupt a game of cricket. And playing fields are protected just as much as listed buildings in the UK. So that was a sort of critical point, that the building could sort of be a bystander. This is a kind of image of post financial crash image of the courtyard. And by then there'd been a lot of kind of cuts in budget. So rather than having 4 staircases, we only had 2. So we really had to work the kind of the circulation around the perimeter of the building. Mainly because now, of course, with accessibility being a priority, you need a lift and every room needs to be accessible. So having too many staircases, too many lifts, and so on. We also lost the fellows flat, and then it became a seminar room. And so other bits of the program changed. A basement was introduced for storage. But the principles of the building remained the same. We also lost the balconies. The college didn't want balconies because they said there's plenty of external space in the college. We would rather kind of focus on the internal accommodation. And then the bedrooms really are only really one type. They vary in size, but very slightly. There are on the ground floor, there are some rooms specially adapted for people with disabilities and carers and so on. But broadly speaking, you have 4 kitchens on each floor, 2 staircases, and the principle that all of those face inwards remains the same. Roof plan with photovoltaics on all sides. And then here you can see the comparison between the original court and our building. And then we went back, in a sense, because we had a much more horizontal organization, to the idea of the cloister as the kind of organizing principle spatially, but also socially, that is really about circumnavigating this garden in the center. So our building is 3 stories. You have an open cloister on the ground floor, and then a closed cloister on the upper 2 floors once you enter the building. And then a slight stepping out, and I'll show you more of that in a second, on the outside. We can talk, I don't know if it's going to be interesting at the end, about the environmental performance, but essentially it is a very, very highly insulated and airtight timber frame building, so 0.1 U value across the board. So very, very low energy building. And then this is the sort of the developed plan with the seminar room, 1 big room on the north side, and then these larger rooms. These are the ones which are made specially for students with special needs, and so it goes. It's about 70 rooms with some very nice rooms on the corner. They're the really go-to ones. So there's a section. can see the birch forest in the center, and we're getting into the kind of working drawings part of the thing. I've shown that before. An important thing once we no longer had the balconies was how to register the building in relation to the original brutalism and this kind of banding that you get on every story height. And this is a building near Cambridge in Essex called Peacock Hall, a kind of Tudor timber frame building, which has this kind of characteristic jettying, it's called. So when you project one floor out above the one below in order to protect it. And that became sort of our version of the concrete band in the center of the at each story in the original building. So there's the kind of the concrete banding on the right, and then ours becomes a kind of cut in the facade, and the curve, the very slight curve, almost like interstice, becomes a sort of a register of those things. By the time the building came back after its pause, we had also changed the materiality for it to be oak, so a much more long-lasting material, and this would be kind of its relationship to the original college. And you can see that the building is like a great deal paler than it actually ended up being, and that will come back in a sec. There you go. There's the cricket going on, the tennis courts beside it. So we're in a sort of this sort of very sort of traditional English sporty kind of landscape. So coming back to the form of the building, the building is this square with these very slightly curved external walls, and it was done entirely in timber frame. So if you imagine these curves, every single one of these beams is a different length. But because the whole thing was modeled and designed digitally, and then it went straight from the digital model to the production, essentially, it made no difference if pieces were the same or different. Here is a model of the corner of the building. It actually evolved quite a lot from here, but we'll show it. And then this is the sort of evolution of the, let's say, the structure, and then building up its kind of secondary structure, and then infill, and how the kind of overall architectural figure sort of derives out of the primary frame. And then this is the college, the original college. This is some views from within. And then they actually had a few very nice, mature birch trees. And one of the things we were really interested that every floor, so the ground floor would really be about these kind of woodland trunks and this kind of understory of garden. And then in the floors above, it really becomes about the canopy of the trees. And this is one of the rooms in which we had many of the kind of project meetings in Cambridge, where the view is just canopy of trees. So kind of very nicely kind of framed and abstracted notion of landscape. The other thing in the original college, which was important to us, was these bay windows, which had these kind of terrazzo benches. And we liked those very much. But because our building was so highly insulated, ours happened in the thickness of the wall. So they would be sort of within the body of the building rather than projecting out. But nevertheless, that thing, the window seat would be important. The elevations are very regular, these buildings, they're very repetitive. And we were really interested in these Quaker buildings, 19th century Quaker buildings in the US, which are essentially very restrained and repetitive buildings, but they always have these kind of very occasional anomalies. So like a missing window there, missing window over here, or an extra one there. So this idea of the sort of the background beat of the project is very regular, but occasional shifts. So we have a basic pattern of windows, which is stepping up to the right on every floor, but then becomes adjusted at the corners. So you sort of doing this sort of repetitive grid all the way around the building, and then at every corner you just recalibrate it in relation to orientation, view, or the room that it serves. The other thing that was very important is that the windows continue exactly the same windows over the staircase, over the kind of the washrooms in the public loos and so on, so that the building does not describe the program. So the building has a sort of meta rhythm, which you don't necessarily see you know, whether it's a primary room, a bedroom, or another thing. The windows are oak frame. They're triple glazed oak frame with these vents on either side. I don't know if any of them are open in this picture. No, they're not. We'll see some in a bit. So they a little bit here. And then you have then your ventilation, passive ventilation comes through these, opening these kind of little sort of shutters, insulated shutters. And there you see the building in relation to the original college. You can see the curve on it, that very slight sort of curve, which somehow makes it stand apart as a freestanding building, more pavilion-like, as I mentioned. And then this is just a quick sequence through the build. This is the big old hole in the ground for the basement. And then coming out of the ground, casting that base, which is the biggest curve in the building. And then the timber frame arriving, the trees were from Slovenia in Central Europe, and then, but it was manufactured in Germany. So it arrived, every single piece digitally cut and numbered, and they just sort of assembled it. It took 2 weeks to put the whole building together. There you can see some of the kind of the drawings, the fabrication drawings, and then there it goes, and quickly assembled. We were really keen on structure, on exposed structure, which is quite difficult to do in timber because of the fire regs. But the structure, as we had done, let's say, in South London Gallery, and in actually during the same time in a Jürgen Teller studio, that the structure becomes a sort of a defining element of the rooms that you're in. It's one of the few bits that users never interfere with. It doesn't get wear and tear, it doesn't get smashed up. So somehow the structure, the ceiling structure, can be sort of remain a very sort of pure motif, even when the program and the use is quite irregular. For reasons I still do not understand, there is one steel beam in this building. The fabricator insisted that this one beam couldn't be done in timber. So in a building that's almost entirely timber structure, there is one beam. And then for the purists and the purist modernists, look away now because you're not going to like what you're going to see. It's actually dressed in timber. And we just thought that that would be, in the end, kind of slightly more fun. If you know where it is, there's one thicker one. So that then the rhythm of the room is not interrupted by this one piece of steel. So there you go, I've fessed up. I'll skip this. We can come back to it if people are interested at the end. This is really to do with the construction and meeting all the kind of thermal, acoustic, fire regs, which go along with a timber building, which are particularly with an exposed structure, which are really complex. But that's essentially the assembly. You have a primary structure, then you have a secondary structure, which actually ended up being made of metal, as you can see here on the top right, which holds most, but not all of the insulation. Then it gets dressed. When the building changes direction, when the kind of sides switch, suddenly you need a kind of really big bit of structure to support the kind of the change in direction. And that for us became really fun because that's when the building starts talking to the original building. So this is our corner, and this is that picture I showed you right at the beginning of the kind of overexpressed concrete structure. So it's like the original brutalist building has somehow reproduced itself a generation later in another material, but has some of the key elements in common. And then we hope that people will really feel that the building, although it's fundamentally different materially, it belongs to the kind of architectural family of Churchill College. One of the things that's characteristic of the college are these precast concrete planks around all the courts, which they lift up for services. So these are the original drawings by Richard Shepherd. And then we decided to use them again. And for visual contrast reasons, we had to have like little things near the edge. And then so you've got this little inset, and it's actually the plan of the building. So that's just a little detail. There are a few like that. So there's the kind of original one, the new sort of slightly more efficient horizontal organization of our building. The staircase, which was meant to be timber, in fact, ended up being not timber, mainly led by the contractor, not for fire reasons, but for speed reasons. So here's the staircase arriving in concrete, and that is so that the building doesn't require any temporary works. So if you have these two cores, essentially you can just build off them without any temporary structure, and then you have a kind of continuous building process that happens. So it's two buildings almost sort of going around one another. But the thing we're interested with the concrete, once we'd accepted that that's the way it had to be, was the relationship between the timber and concrete. And so we sized the concrete elements to be the same as the timber ones, so that it feels like kind of scar tissue, or a little bit like that initial Japanese picture where the stone and the timber are behaving in identical ways, that this, you would somehow feel like this belonged to the same kind of language as the primary timber structure. And of course, there is a profound relationship between timber and concrete. So this is a picture of the original board marked concrete in the college, and these are some of the samples of oak that we wanted to use. We wanted to use reclaimed oak, partly to, of course, to save on the carbon footprint of the building, but also partly to kind of get that texture, the kind of brutalist texture that you get from this old timber. And then the old timber also tunes in color-wise with the brickwork. The timber actually comes from the decks of freight trains. We don't know exactly where it comes from, because it comes from trains, and it's around about 1900 to 1910, we think. And these are the boards in France, really, really thick oak boards, really nicely weathered. And suddenly then the image of the project changes. So this is one of the last renderings that we did, was the building not as a kind of light timber thing, but as a really dark, kind of brutalist timber thing. So that's the sort of the journey of the BCA, is where we found the timber. These maps were like the sources of various types of reused timber. So this is the original board at the bottom, and then some of the processing that we had to do to it. Of course, reused timber was something that we'd done before. So we have a project from maybe 3 or 4 years before this called Treehouse, which was made around a mulberry tree. It's a timber frame building, even on timber foundations. And I won't go into all the reasons why it's bending around the mulberry tree, but it is. And it's made actually from Australian hardwood, from Jarrah, that was used in the railway industry. And then it's sliced up into thin pieces, and it was done for Lizzie Tripp. This is the client who was wheelchair bound and needed a kind of horizontal house. That actually horizontal, it's actually tilted on a slope so that it takes her from street to garden. In her wheelchair, which is a very keen gardener, which is why we had to keep the tree. And she had seen, before we did this, she had seen a project we had done at ETH here in Zurich, just a few yards from where I'm sitting right now, with my students, which was a design build project in 2 weeks out to reclaim timber. Lizzie had seen this project, and she said, "Oh, I really like the texture of this kind of old wood. Can we do that with my little house, very low budget?" So this is the sort of, you could say, the origin, this little kind of barn or kind of temple-like, chapel-like building that the students built. In fact, I am sitting in this room here right now. So there we go. So that all of those stories were brought through into the detailing of the building. This is the mock-up. You can see the actual building happening in the reflection here. So we cut and treated the boards so that then they made a very kind of coherent assembly for the facade. We wanted to have a solid piece in the corner, and then we scratched the surface, the kind of the aged surface on the top to make a cornice. And that then this is the kind of assembly pattern. So there's quite a lot of tolerance in it. Oak moves quite a bit. I had to use stainless steel screws because oak has a lot of tannins and quite corrosive. This is the corner. And then on the inside of the building, on the inside of the cloister, we used new oak. So then you get this kind of really rough husk and a kind of slightly more refined internal thing. These are the boards once they're processed. That cornice of just surface, the kind of surface taken away from the old timber, which sort of assembles itself like this. And of course, that is borrowed from the entrance gate of Churchill College, which is this cast aluminium, which has this kind of curve. So you get this sense that this very, very slow curve, which is in the plan of the building, is in the decoration, actually is coming out of observations of the original college. So here is the building, and you can see the cornice. Now it's barely visible, actually, because the building is much, much grayer than it was when it was first built. And then you can sort of see it being gradually finished, this sort of kind of square, slightly entasis block. And then, of course, the nature arrives, the nature which is totally not natural, of course, as it is, let's say, in another project, where the gardens were very important. This is a picture by Jürgen Teller for his studio. This is the planting of the trees, a very, very physical, rough act. It's probably the most kind of rough part of the building process, even though these trees are very, in a sense, also very fragile, particularly environmentally. And this is, let's say, the planting of the trees at the Teller studio, more or less simultaneous with Cowan Court. And then very quickly, then the kind of the garden takes over and becomes the sort of the defining feature of the thing. So it was sort of going on at the same time. And then being in the UK, of course, rain is a major thing, and it might not make the best day out all the time, but it's certainly great for landscapes, and that's why maybe England is very has a very long garden tradition, is because the conditions are very good. So the architecture really has to kind of take charge of this thing. So on the right, there's Jürgen Teller's studio, where the rainwater is collected in water butts. It overflows into a tank below ground. And in Cambridge, maybe slightly lower budget, it's actually just paving slabs with gravel inside, just turned 45 degrees. And then right at the center of the elevation, the water rushes out, goes in there, and then goes into a tank below ground and is used in summer for watering the garden. And they become sort of central elements in the internal elevations of the college. So here we go. We're nearly there. These are, you can see these pictures from within the courtyard. You can see the kind of precast planks, the entrances to the staircases. Occasionally that concrete is revealed where you can. There's that idea of the kind of the bay window of the original college, and then the deep window of the new one. This is it once it's inhabited. These are genuine student rooms. We pictured them all once they were inhabited. This is a kind of one of the kind of the nicer kind of homely kind of qualities, and so on. This is quite nice. The one that had the piano by the window overlooking the playing fields is also a nice moment. This is those corner rooms where you get the sort of the double window, which is that one up there, which I would say is the prize room in the building. So there you have it. There's the building. This is approaching it from the college itself. So this one on the right, you can see how the building, although it's fundamentally different to the original buildings, it kind of tunes itself in terms of texture and color and feeling with the original building. The entrance coming from the college, this is it with the foreground of the original college. The approach, these are right just after the building was finished. So that's why the kind of the earth is still very earthy. And then my final image is the moment when that copper beech tree, which was there right at the beginning, which was in that picture of the mock-up, suddenly in November sheds its leaves, and then the building actually looks more like the tree than it does the original college. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. It was a fantastic journey through Cowan Court. And now I will pass it to Sigra, who will do the response.
Thank you, and thank you, Guillermo, for this amazing responsibility to answer to Tom. I always enjoy Tom lectures, and I'm always extremely suspicious about them, especially the first image, a floating tree, that it comes up from the sky, like nature always comes from the sky, as you always like to say in your lectures. And I think it's a beautiful opening for a project that somehow is able to capture many of the basis of the practice of 6A, right? Kind of trees as knowledge that arrive from the sky and gets into that enclosed space that is the garden. The garden is other word, other space, a space that not by chance organized the way knowledge is produced in many universities in England, right? Like a separated world, a world that is autonomous and is constructed. And the things that arrive from the sky, of course, never arrive actually from the sky. They come from other places. And that also summarizes quite well the way Stephanie and Tom work, right? In what initially, when one looks at the work and looks at the way they explain the work, because it's kind of a really interesting tension between these two things. They're full of pieces of knowledge that arrive from somewhere, that kind of land there in this seemingly private world, right? That could be populated like people like Perec or Sempe or Tati, not necessarily from their work, but from their attitude, but also from all these pieces that come from other places. Then carefully through the lecture today, for example, we've seen how they are kind of tied back somewhere else, tied back to a context that is expansive, of course, that sometimes is a few meters away from the building, sometimes it's farther away. This attitude toward knowledge is probably what differentiates them from the way knowledge is produced in universities. And that's how how this mirror image of the Cambridge College that is this court is so interesting, because it's obviously taking a lot of attitude through the kind of the production of knowledge of universities, the production and reproduction of knowledge that happens in the university, but also continuously reminding us of a different approach to this production, where the quote, the cite, the way one relates to the reference and to the original is not simply a form of kind of constructing authority, right? Which is, as often happens in academic institutions, where you don't only use those pieces of history, those values, as to claim that you actually have the authority to do so, but it has a much more playful, maybe British relationship with it. Ad hoc, some people has called it, or metis in the kind of the Greek word that was kind of presented in the word never modern, right? This kind of relationship that allows to use knowledge and quotation and reference, these kind of words that for architects are so important, in the way that in a sort of endless bricolage, right? In a way that doesn't necessarily, maybe bricolage has been used too much to describe your work. Actually, I will prefer to use dilettante, right? This kind of playful way to actually relate with these things that allows to be an expert and not be an expert. And I think it's an expression that you sometimes use, saying that remind us of precisely how little we know, right? Like all this play, it's impressive. And I just want to both congratulate and ask anyone that is listening to the lecture to just be extremely suspicious about it, because it's something that requires an incredible level of care and knowledge for all these pieces, right? These are things that are not used like it had happened, for example, through the post-modern period as, jokes and ways to look a little bit smart, but actually reveals that the relationship with the ordinary, as probably is inscribed in, the relationship with people like Perec, is much more personal and much more intimate. It's not, again, something that allows you to present yourself as a carrier of certain knowledge, but actually something that allows you to relate differently with what it surrounds you, right? So I want to ask you directly, no way, what is your relationship with the quote on the side and literally the copy, right? Copy is this word that in architecture both is an anathema. It's something that, if an architect is accused of copying, kind of goes back to the primal fear, right? Like the originality of the architect is absolutely kind of still present in our practice. But at the same time, we know that architecture is by definition a kind of an endless act of borrowing and generosity. We just keep explaining to everyone. What is your relationship? How you feel about copying? Is something that you like, you don't like? Is something that you admit? Is something that you ask your students to do?
Yes, in some respects. I suppose that I probably don't use the word copy that often, but the act of copying is inevitable. I mean, partly, you're doing a series of talks about student housing projects, right? So they belong to a certain tradition. Nobody in the series you've seen today has invented student housing, So to some extent, we're all sort of building on that which came before us, and hopefully everybody is then adding something to the discourse, to the kind of estate of student housing. So while some copying is inevitable, I tend not to use the word. I mean, I really like Bruno Latour's description, where he at one point says, well, you have to remember that design is only ever redesign, which is kind of a very obvious and profound truth. The proportion of what is new to what is known is very much in favor of what is known. So you're somehow always reorganizing. You talked about knowledge a lot. You're always reorganizing knowledge in hopefully new configurations to reveal or to propose new ways of living and new opportunities. But nevertheless, it is largely kind of knowledge that belongs to culture generally, and it moves around in quite complicated ways, sometimes fast, sometimes slow. So I suppose that the notion of the copy, so let's say working in Cambridge, in the competition we did, we were the only practice to propose a court building, right? And then to us, it just seemed like an absolute no-brainer. Like, how do you start? And they've been doing it for about 800 years, and it seems to work. So we thought, well, are we really going to, correct this by not doing a court? There are some buildings which are not court buildings in Cambridge, and some of them are extremely good. There are some housing ones which are not courts, but in this case, we were, let's say, and maybe in many other cases, we were very interested in setting out a very clear background field, so the court. And then once you've sort of established some of those basic parameters, you've done the organizational side, the way people might move. So it's a lot of the kind of technical, rational elements. And then you can then explore the ways in which it's different. So the first half of the design process was really exploring how our building is different to all the Churchill ones. So how doing a building in timber, so our building is 100% organic, almost 90-something% organic, whereas the original buildings are sort of 90% mineral, brick and concrete. So you could say it starts by being everything that's different, but once the building starts gaining its body, its character, you start realizing actually it's got an enormous amount in common with buildings. So everything you thought was different suddenly becomes similar. So the timber actually ends up having very similar texture to the board mark concrete. So what we thought was fundamentally different ends up being fundamentally the same. And that's a sort of, series of kind of contradictions or complexities. Let's say we're getting a little bit Venturi-esque here, but that we enjoy. That's something where it's not quite as oppositional. It's not to do with whether is it dark or is it light, is it heavy or is it lightweight. It's somehow all of these things all the time, and you're always somehow wrapping in different stimuli. And then coming to that kind of your comment, which I really appreciate your reflections there. We work, you could say, within an academic context in which the production of knowledge is fundamental, and the methodology and its rigor kind of is foundational to its capacity to contribute to the world. And that is, have many colleagues in this building who are doing that, all the time, whether it be in history and theory or in technology or other fields. When you are in the field of design, there is a point at which all of these references, all of this knowledge somehow has to be transformed in the architect's imagination. And therefore, that's the moment where it no longer becomes true. It's no longer true to its origins, it's true to its destination. And its destination, if that has value, if that has meaning, then it becomes autonomous. And it doesn't really matter whether you were a little bit selective with your histories or you adjusted a story in order to somehow bring closure to a design idea. And that's something I'm very comfortable with, as long as we don't make false claims, and in the field of design, in the end, we're in the business of inventing things, not so. Going back to this notion of the copying may have been part of the process, but it's not the end you're looking for. The reason perhaps also why I'm quite relaxed with the act of copying is that in architecture, it's pretty much impossible. Like, even if you try to replicate something, your ground conditions, the industries that produce it, the economies that will make it happen, the purpose or the people who commission it and their aims will always drift you away from that which you are copying, and then you will end up with a new thing. And so in that sense, I'm very relaxed with the fact that things that we have seen, things that we have observed and documented, might form the basis of, might form some sort of starting point or even interruption in the design process. And essentially the design process is producing these things, but it's also an accumulation of a series of small judgments over time, which are always recalibrating and putting in place those things that you've become interested in. Because I could do another talk, which would be maybe quite a dull talk, but it would be possible, of all the design ideas that were not built in Cowan Court, right? There is a sort of, there is an outtakes, which is things we thought about. Yeah, which we thought about, but somehow, for whatever reason, technical, financial, they never find. And then some of them may be in other projects. We don't really count them, but so there's a lot of sort of stuff that falls off the process.
In this question of the possible other talks, I think there's also a connection between, or a kind of not connection, rather an interesting tension in the way things happen, and then these things get built. And of course, it's almost impossible not to be different from the originals. But at the same time, the way you talk about the things that your decision making, or the way you explain your design process, it seems to me you are not afraid of keeping these references really close to yourself, right? Like, or I'm thinking about the way that you used to explain Raven Road, but basically using only the images of the archive that you found and things like that, in which literally the new thing disappeared of the narration of the like that is quite different from, okay, I think an avant-garde fear from the copy, right? Like, so all these claims of newness that basically consist on hiding where you're copying from, or where you, like, this is, I discovered this architect that nobody has looked in the last 40 years, and I'm using all these things, and the whole claim is that it's new, therefore I never mention where is the origin, or even the kind of the way, kind of, when you're talking about Venturi, I would say other more like kind of Posmo figures in the States will kind of use the reference as sort of a smart thing to say, like, oh, this corner here is actually from that guy, and that's actually pretty good. But your relationship has this kind of brutal literalness, almost reappropriating. It kind of reminds me sometimes some kind of operation conceptual art, of reappropriating things and almost claiming themselves as being your work now. That I always find kind of extremely attractive as a practice. And I find the kind of the way you explain Raven Road incredibly amazing. That, are you still comfortable with that? I was wondering, like, when you go to gardens, so now you're talking so much about gardens, maybe the references are different, or kind of have gone into a different condition that all these things.
Yeah, no, I guess it has changed. It has evolved. I mean, Raven Road was a long time ago. And so I was there actually very recently, because we're doing some refurb of the refurb. 13 years ago, nothing major, just a little bit of repair, maintenance. And I was kind of quite nostalgic for it. There were moments I went in and went, oh, that's sweet. Like, maybe not quite the way I would do it now, but maybe that's good, but I think that the kind of the gradual shift away from, let's say, from an idea of the kind of the layering of history, kind of very naturally became the layering, growth and decay of the garden. So the two processes are very much attached to this notion that the world is in a constant state of growth and decay simultaneously. So the mindset or the design process is not so different when you are, let's say, trying to come to terms with like these amazing archives that we'd found, or a kind of natural history. To some extent, I feel like they belong to the same mindset. But you're right to identify something like the ready-made as being really important, and some of the acts of, I mean, it becomes a bit pretentious when we start talking about kind of conceptual art and experimental poetics. But in Georges Perec's work, the French writer from the kind of 60s, 70s, 80s. One of his first books, called Things, one of his first novels, he, whenever he got stuck as a writer, he would graft in a paragraph from one of his favorite books, from French literature, from Balzac, from Flaubert, and people like that. He would just graft in a paragraph and then write his prose to connect with it, and then would write out of it. And it was a device to somehow move the prose along. And then the book was published, and then Raymond Queneau, who was this almost like father figure, like one of the surrealist writers, kind of smelt, had a strong sense that something was not quite right with this book, that there was a sort of familiarity to it. And then he described it after reading it, saying, I felt like I'd read the book before, even though it was brand new. And I always thought that that was a kind of like, wow, you know, how amazing is it to achieve something that feels like you know it, yet it is also new. And that's somehow, it's not something that we spend a lot of time kind of thinking about in the design process, but if that is some of the qualities that people feel, and some people have said about, I think particularly South London Gallery, they still said, yeah, I went to see it. It's kind of, it's very strange to go in a new building that feels haunted. And I thought, okay, that's about as good a review as I could wish for. So that's where, you know, this sort of evolution and kind of also getting into a process. I suppose the thing that I've also really loved the idea of, I find very liberating, is the idea that when we finish our work, the work is not done, that somebody else will have a go, other people will use it, it will be changed. We are just one little moment along, you know, very, very long story. And you become, I think you end up being much more relaxed if you do not see your work as a kind of fixed artifact, and but just something that you kind of add to. Becoming more and more interested in the whole notion of maintenance. That's becoming, let's say, that's like my new obsession. Partly going back to conceptual art, there's this rather fantastic art movement called maintenance art, which is like part of a kind of sort of feminist conceptual art thing about what is the work that goes on to sustain institutions. Ukeli Lederman did this kind of amazing piece where the opening of her exhibition, she was scrubbing the steps of the museum, and then, you know, the great and the good had to sort of step over her, kind of maintaining the building. And the notion that today, you know, modernism more or less erased maintenance as a primary cultural creative act, because it promised that these new things would be perfect. Yeah. And they're not, and they're as flawed as everybody who made them.
Yeah. And I think that's, Tom, a fantastic way to close, because I think now you are starting to maintain your own buildings, as you were mentioning with Raven Row. And I was just, when you were thinking, I'm imagining you and Stephanie in 10 years redesigning again Cowan Court, a new court that appears there, and how different and how the same it will be. And I think there is no better way to close. Like, I think everybody in the audience have already seen Cowan Court. Yeah. Thank you very much, Tom, for your time today, and have a very good day in Zurich. Thanks a lot. And you come to Sydney, to Australia soon. Just pass by Sydney. It's better than Melbourne.
I hope so. Thank you very much. It's been really nice to chat to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Good weekend.